We are finally approaching the assembly stage on our B&M 250 Supercharger rebuild, but before we get to that, we still need to do a little bit of work on the rotors. These were set aside after the initial disassembly, and we haven't touched them since. The first thing we'll do is grab our number punches so that we can make positive identification marks. There could be minor fitment or dimensional differences side by side, so the best practice is just to put them back where they were. The biggest change we'll be making to these rotors is going to be replacing the Teflon seals. The tips of these rotors have seats machined into them to hold onto these white strips. Superchargers with seals like these typically run tighter clearances. On this one, the Teflon should be just 3 to 4 thousandths of an inch from the case, and generally non-stripped rotors run at least twice that. Clearly, the seals on these rotors have seen better days, but at least they're all still in one piece. We're gonna have a go at replacing these, though it's something I had never done myself or even seen. I had just heard the process described. We'll just have to try to figure it out as we go, starting with removing the old strips. What ended up working pretty well was using a razor knife to cut along the length of the strip, and then a punch to lift the strip out of its seat, which let us peel the whole thing out in one piece. Getting a grip on the end of the piece can be a little bit tricky, but once you do, it comes right out. Okay, so the rotors are Teflon free. What's next? Well, actually, that's pretty much it. There's not a lot of other disassembly we'll be doing here. The aluminum rotor extrusions are pinned to their steel shafts, and that's not something that's supposed to come apart. At the rear of those rotor shafts are the inner bearing races for the rear bearings, and we're just gonna leave them in place. They look difficult to remove, and like they're in pretty decent shape. Except for a bit of old grease and rust that we will try to clean up. Those bearing races have tiny little retaining clips, which we will pop off to make this cleaning job easier. We'll use Scotch-Brite to give a gentle polish to those bearing surfaces and remove any rust in the area. This is the tried and true WD-40 and red Scotch-Brite polish that I'll use on pretty much anything, such as the front ends of the rotor shafts, as well as the entire outside of the aluminum extrusions. Because of the two-piece construction of these, we need to clean them a bit differently, and we'll settle for just paper towels and carb cleaner. We especially have to make sure there's no abrasive material left anywhere near that rear bearing assembly. After the initial cleaning, we'll reinstall the retaining clips for those bearing races, and then give everything one last spray down. Following that, really all that's left is to install new Teflon strips. This is from the blower shop. It is 3/16 of an inch half-round Teflon, which multiple sources told me is what B&M used. This roll is 10 feet of the stuff, which should be enough to do our rotors twice, but I'm sure the process won't go perfectly, so it's good to have extra on hand. From what I had read, the preferred method for installing these was to use locking pliers to pull the strips along the rotors. It's a bit tricky to get it started at the corner, but once it is, hopefully we can just pull it in line with the rotor lobe, and oh yeah, this is going to be a pain in the ass. In the interest of time, we're going to do some summarizing here. There were two main issues I kept having. The first was that the Teflon strip would jump out at the corner of the rotor lobe, and the second is that the strip would just tear. It was taking a lot of force to pull these strips through, and it felt like I wasn't able to get parallel enough to the rotors with the locking pliers, so we're just going to switch to needle nose. And after making that switch, using one hand to guide the Teflon at the corner of the lobe and the other to pull it through seemed to be working. It's a bit of a strange feeling process because there's a fair amount of elasticity to the Teflon, and the harder you pull on it, the thinner it gets, which means it slides through the slot a bit easier. In this case, we had to pull the strip back and forth to make sure it was fully seated down in that dovetail. The next one proved difficult to get started, but once we were able to, it pulled most of the length of the lobe. It did break right at the pliers about 3/4 of the way through, but luckily there was enough left there to just keep pulling and drag it the rest of the way. Okay, not too bad. On to the third. Once again, there was a bit of difficulty in getting it started, but once it decided to cooperate, this one pulled through nice and easy. By the fourth, I was starting to get the technique down, and it seems like a little bit of a twist helps it get into that slot much more cleanly. Then you grab the end of the Teflon and pull it down as close to the seat as possible. And you continue that process all the way across the rotor for a nice, clean install. I don't know if this one was just a particularly tight fit or what, but fourth try is the charm, and we finally get it all the way across. I'd like to point out once again that I don't know what I'm doing, so I'm not sure if this is bad technique, bad fitment, or just how the process normally goes. We'll let the rotors sit overnight to give the Teflon a chance to settle, and while it doesn't really seem like they moved, it was still worth a try, and we will cut all of those flush with the ends of the rotors. At this stage, it's worth noting that the strips definitely sit taller than the old ones. They were pretty much flat on the top. These are still very much half rounds. What I saw from several different people online is that these B&M Teflon tipped superchargers don't really need to be trimmed down on a lathe like a lot of other designs do, and you can get away with just putting the supercharger back together and running them in, which was a pretty pleasing concept to me. I decided to just leave the Teflon as is, so with that, the parts have been prepped, and I think we have everything we're going to need to put this thing together. Other than the bearing races on the rear of the rotor shafts, we will be replacing every bearing and seal in the unit. Instead of trying to piece all this together individually, it made sense just to get a rebuild kit since one was available. Most of the parts we'll be using came from that kit, although the Teflon strips and this sight glass we'll be installing into the front cover were separate purchases. We'll be reusing the majority of the fasteners, but we do have some new washers to spiff things up a bit. Here are some of the parts from the rebuild kit. Starting at the top left, we've got the snout bearing, snout seal, and snout bearing retaining clip. In the middle, 4 new rotor shaft seals. And on the right, 2 rear and 2 front rotor bearings. Our model uses single row ball bearings in the front, while some use double, and in general it was hard to find any of these part numbers ahead of time without taking ours apart or having the rebuild kit here in front of us. So in case it could help somebody else, here's a full list of part numbers. That list will be down in the video description as well. After all the time and effort spent cleaning all this up, it is very satisfying to have it all laid out in front of us. I'm extremely happy with the color and finish on all the parts we painted. It looks great and seems to be plenty durable. A few of the bare aluminum parts, like that upper pulley, we'll just polish up with Scotch-Brite and WD-40. And the rest of the parts that we didn't already clean on camera will get sprayed with carburetor cleaner and thoroughly wiped down. Then finally, each and every one of the bolts had a thread chaser run onto it to ensure that they install smoothly. The keen-eyed among you might have noticed that the input shaft shown here is not the nice machined one that we had made at the end of the last episode. That's because, well, it hadn't been made yet. I was still looking for a shop to do the work, but I didn't want to leave these parts sitting around forever, and I figured that this bolted together one was good enough for a test assembly. Other than a light coat of oil to prevent rust, the rear bearings are dry, so we'll do our best to pack them with grease. This was mildly successful, but I definitely made a big mess, so we will clean up the outsides of those bearings before moving forward. Next, they'll be introduced to their new home in the rear bearing plate. Since I had scraped up, sandblasted, and polished the outsides of these bores, I wanted a little bit of insurance to make sure that these were going to stay in place, so we will coat the outsides of these bearings with a bit of medium strength thread locker. We'll line that bearing up on the plate starting with the driver's side and use a 24mm socket to hammer it in. Once that's bottomed out and not going any farther, we'll apply some thread locker to the passenger side bearing and get it pressed in as well. With both of them in place, we'll clean up any excess Loctite and add even more grease. There's a fine line between just enough and too much here, and I don't know where it is, so we'll lean towards the side of too much. Hopefully any excess grease will just get pushed out past the seals, which are the last parts we need to install on the rear bearing plate. Once again, we'll give the outer diameter of the new part a touch of blue thread locker before hammering it in, this time with a 15/16 inch socket. This requires a lot less force than the bearings, and will go around in circles to make sure that it's pressed in evenly. Once it has been, we get to do it all over again on the other side. We'll give that a final wipe down to make sure there's no thread locker where it shouldn't be, and move on to the front bearing plate. These bearings will be installed in the same way, using thread locker, a socket, and a hammer. I thought it was strange to be using sealed bearings when the old ones weren't, but really didn't think too much of it since they came from the blower shop themselves. Of course, it was only after assembling this that it really started to bother me, and I gave the shop a call and was told you are supposed to remove the seals before installing the bearings. Whoops. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we will be taking this unit apart again, and in the process, removing those seals. It's easy to just pry those out with an O-ring pick, and now the bearings will have access to the gear oil that will be filling the front of the case. Back in the sealed-in present of the first assembly, we've got 4 retaining clips to deal with. We'll be reusing the old ones as no new ones were included in the kit. The 2 larger clips go in front of the bearings to keep them from sliding out of their bores, and we will get those installed with a pair of snap ring pliers. With those fully in their grooves, we'll flip the plate over and install the first of the smaller clips. This slots in behind the bearing and acts as a shoulder to help locate the seal. These are identical to the ones we just installed in the rear bearing plate, and they go in just the same. After popping in the final snap ring and the last seal, the front bearing plate is ready to go. Up next is our old friend, the input shaft, which is in need of a bearing. It's quite similar to the front rotor bearings, but a little bit bigger in size, and this one is supposed to keep its seals. Once the inner diameter of the bearing has been given a thin coating of Loctite, we'll use a 22mm socket to hammer it on. And now we can install that highly questionable input shaft into the front bearing support. Once more, we'll apply a bit of thread locker and use a socket, in this case a 36mm, to bottom that out. Then we can go ahead and start feeding in the new snap ring, and use a small flat blade screwdriver to gently pry it into place. Finally, we have the front seal, which will get a certainly superfluous coating before being tapped in with that same 36mm socket. Once that's bottomed out against the retaining clip and about flush with the front surface, we'll wipe off the excess red debris from the coating on that seal and get some oil on the pulley coupler. We'll place the drive key in the input shaft, line it up with the notch in the coupler, and press that on. We were able to get that most of the way installed by hand, and a few light taps will get it flush with the end of the coupler. Now all we have to do is get that central hold-down bolt tightened, but how exactly do we do so? We certainly could do this after assembling the rest of the blower, but to do it now, we'll run 2 long bolts into the coupler and clamp those down in the vise. The bolt and washers we're going to use came with the Wyand parts kit, and will get a bit of blue thread locker before being torqued to 30 foot-pounds. With a solid click on that, it seems like the bearing support spins nicely, so we'll separate the shaft and coupler and get ready to install the whole snout assembly onto the front case cover. There are 2 1/4-inch NPT threaded ports on that cover, the top of which is to fill it with oil, and we'll just loosely thread in a plug there for now. The port partway down the front of the cover is for checking the oil fill level, and from the factory would have just had a solid plug, but we've got a nice glass sight check plug to install instead. We'll apply a bit of thread sealer to that and get it tightened down nice and snug. For the interface between the snout and the front cover, we cut a custom gasket. Typically, I think a sealer is used on this connection, but it makes it a little bit more annoying to take apart in the future. With that laid in place on the cover, we'll drop the snout onto it and get ready to install the 6 mounting bolts. Each of these 1/4-inch 20 cap screws will get a dab of blue thread locker as they're installed, and once they're all started, we'll snug them down in a crisscross pattern. Then, using that same order, we'll torque each of them to 100 inch-pounds. A lot of these torque specs are just guesses based on the size of the fastener and what they're being threaded into, but that should be about correct. With that done, the front case cover and bearing support are ready to go. Next, we're going to need the rotors, which will have to be retrieved from the freezer. Those have been in there overnight to make things shrink a little bit and hopefully ease the assembly process. We'll apply some engine oil to all 4 of the seals and then get the rotors unpacked. Due to the outside humidity, there's a bit of frost forming on them, so we'll give the ends of the rotor shafts one final wipe down with carburetor cleaner before getting the first one lined up on the front bearing plate. We'll use a mallet to tap that in, and it actually went on there fairly easily, so there's a decent chance the cold is helping. That's the first rotor installed, and we'll do the same thing for the second. Well, I tried, but for whatever reason, this rotor did not want to press into its bearing. Instead of just hammering the hell out of it, we'll try to use a bolt to pull it through. We'll start it off using one of the old gear bolts, and then switch to a longer one to finish pulling the rotor shaft all the way through that bearing. Next, we'll set the rotors up vertically and get ready to install the case over top of them. To help ensure that this thing will come apart peacefully in the future, we will be putting anti-seize on all 4 of the locating dowels. Then we'll make sure that front gasket surface is nice and clean and drop a new gasket into place. The rebuild kit came with 2 thicknesses of case gaskets. For this front one, we're using one of the thicker 1/1500th of an inch gaskets. With everything ready, we will carefully lower the case over the rotors from above. We'll make sure the locating pins are aligned through both the gasket and the bearing plate, and then start tapping the case down. We're using a dead blow mallet around the edge of the case, going corner to corner and side to side to make sure it is pressing downward evenly. For the last little bit, we'll rearrange so that the dowel pins can poke all the way through that front bearing plate. By this point, everything was looking good, but I was finding the rotors pretty difficult to turn. This was not unexpected, as I had heard stories about people getting blowers back from rebuild shops that they couldn't turn by hand. So I knew that with new Teflon strips, sometimes they could be stiff, but I had no idea how hard to turn was too hard to turn. To get ready to install the rear plate, we'll anti-seize the pins, drop on another one of the thick gaskets, and make sure the bearing races on the rear of the rotor shafts are nice and clean. We'll get the plate lined up on each of the rotors, and then the 2 locating dowels. At least that was the goal, but it seemed like it wouldn't be quite that easy this time. I ended up using one of these clamps to get the plate in alignment, and threading in 2 bolts to hold the plate there. We'll repeat that on the other side and get 2 more bolts threaded in. With those holding the rear cover in alignment, now we can switch to the dead blow hammer and finally tap it fully into place. I had read that the rear covers on these could be difficult to install after restripping, so having to do all of this didn't seem too unusual. We'll remove those 4 long bolts and thread in 4 of the actual rear cover bolts to make sure everything stays put. We'll finish up on the rear bolts later. For now, we're going to work on getting the gears installed, and to make sure the front bearing plate doesn't move around, we'll thread 4 bolts down into it. Starting on the passenger side, we'll place the key on the input shaft and slide the gear over top of that. We'll give that a few taps with the hammer, going around in circles to make sure it is evenly seated. Then we'll use a bolt with a stack of washers to pull the gear down onto the shaft. This was working just fine, right up until the gear bottomed out against that front bearing plate. For this first test fit, we didn't put any shims between the bearing and the gear. Obviously, some were going to be required. The blower had come with 5 individual shims with no indication of where any of them came from. These are typically placed over the rotor shaft between the front bearing and the gear to set the timing of the rotors very precisely. Since the teeth are helical, moving a gear out of plane with the other one will rotate it just a little bit, and that adjustment is used at the factory to make sure the rotors are the right distance from each other. You definitely don't want them hitting. The only way for us to set this is ye old guess and check. As it turns out, we needed 2 shims under each of the gears to keep them from hitting the case. So, assuming the 5 shims we have are all of them, we've got a 50-50 shot at installing that last one in the correct place. We'll be putting this thing together with 3 shims on the passenger side and 2 on the driver's side. Hopefully, that gets us where we need to be. With that stack of shims, the gear seems like a good fit, but we still need to find a way to turn that rotor so that we can get everything aligned. What I came up with to do this was removing that gear and installing the driver's side gear with a pair of bolts. This allowed for the use of a pry bar, which gave a lot of leverage and allowed us to turn the rotors into the positions they needed to be in. By this point, even with no standard with which to judge exactly how tight the supercharger is, this wasn't seeming right. But it is turning, and we're already this far along, we may as well see this assembly through. To set those gears in place, we'll apply thread locker to the bolts and torque them to 30 foot-pounds. This did not require holding the rotor still, which continues to be disconcerting. Moving on, we can slot the coupler into place on the driver's side gear and install 4 thread-locked bolts, which will get torqued to 10 foot-pounds. With that on there, we'll remove the 4 bolts holding the front bearing plate in place, install the gasket using the dowel pins to hold it up, and install the front cover assembly with a generous coating of grease on the input shaft splines. We'll make sure the front cover is aligned on the dowels, and then again apply some thread locker and install the 10 bolts around its perimeter. We'll hand tighten each of those, going around in a crisscross pattern and then going back through with a torque wrench set to 100 inch-pounds. Then we'll flip the case around and do the same for the 10 bolts holding on the rear cover. These bolts will also be tightened to 100 inch-pounds. That was, theoretically, the last step for the supercharger itself. If we're ever going to be able to make this thing turn, we should be able to do it now. And, it is not going well. Eventually, through struggling to hold it still on the bench and turn the input shaft at the same time, I was able to make it move just a little tiny bit. The force required to do so was not insubstantial and ended up being enough to bend those 2 grade 8 1/4-inch bolts. Yeah, we're gonna need a different approach. Which is how this thing I have dubbed the turning tool came into existence. It's just a flat piece of 1/4-inch aluminum with holes to mount it to the coupler and a 5/8-inch bolt on the other side. That should let us apply a lot of force to turn this thing, but before we get to that, we should probably fill the front of the case with oil, so we'll remove the fill plug and start pouring in 80 W90. The general rule of thumb here is to have the level about halfway up the glass. And once it's filled to that point, which took about 5 ounces of oil, we can reinstall the fill plug. Now that the gears are lubricated, we can install the turning tool using the 4 pulley bolts. To help hold the case still, we've also clamped it to the bench because it really wanted to move around last time we tried to turn it. It requires a lot of force, and there are noticeable hang-ups every time one of those Teflon strips comes in contact with the case. And to be certain, the sandblasted interior is doing us no favors. After a few spins, it does seem to be turning a bit easier, but I don't see anything wearing in on those Teflon strips. The instruction manual for the Holley version of the supercharger says that even before the Teflon strips have been seated, the turning torque should not exceed 25 inch-pounds. We're at about 45 foot-pounds to get this thing started turning. While actively turning, it seems like about 35 foot-pounds, but that's still 17 times the maximum torque suggested by that Holley manual. To hopefully help get things moving a bit more easily, we'll try the old staple. On a running engine, the rotors will be lubricated by the fuel flowing through them, so this isn't too outrageous of an idea. And after a few times around, it is definitely making a difference, and the rotors are turning so much more easily. We'll keep at it and periodically wipe off the Teflon strips before spraying them down again. There's a lot of gray appearing on the strips, but it does wipe right off, and I think what we're seeing is just the inside of the case being polished. The other thing I was starting to notice is that the tops of the strips seem to be flattening out, which means that this is working. Now that we can turn it over, we can also look for wear marks, indicating something is hitting where it shouldn't be, and I don't see any, but what we should really do is check the clearances. Of course, at the time I didn't have a long feeler gauge, which is what you really want to use, but it did seem like the rotors were evenly spaced and reasonably far apart. And again, it was tough to measure, but it seemed like there was at least 0.010 of an inch of clearance between the rotors and the bearing plates. The turning force was obviously still a concern, but I decided to just spin the thing for a while and see if it got any better. And while it still wasn't feeling great, it was definitely starting to loosen up. But that's all with a wrench. What I really wanted to do was use our long-suffering power drill to spin it. It's hardly graceful, but that drill did manage to do it. Since things were more or less looking up, I decided it was time to install the carburetor adapter. We'll lay down our custom gasket, and then drop the carburetor adapter down on top of it. To hold it down, we'll be using these. I picked up 8 5/16 by 18 1-inch long cap screws that should be just right to hold down this adapter plate. The amount of thread engagement to the case is, well, cutting it pretty close, which is why the torque spec for these is only 10 foot-pounds. Seriously, there are only 2 or 3 threads into the cast aluminum, so tightening these down was pretty nerve-wracking. At least once the carburetor's on there, these bolts really can't back out because they won't have anywhere to go. That all looks good, and so does the carburetor adapter. It's kind of easy to forget everything we had to go through to get it to sit on there in the first place. It was just about time to test fit the supercharger on the engine when I was turning it over just a few more times on the bench, and this happened. Yep, that Teflon strip sure does have a tear in it. I can only assume it has to do with the strips being too tight for the case and forced round and round and round. It's not unthinkable that something like this was going to happen, but when it actually did, well, it didn't feel great. I can't stress enough how much of a learning experience this supercharger rebuild has been. There's a lot I know now that I wish I knew then, but isn't that just how life goes? Oh. Ow. The blower is back together, but it's not going to stay that way for long. In the next episode, we will be re-stripping the rotors and trimming them down. How are we going to do that? Yeah, I guess we'll have to figure that out next time.